Hello ladies and gentlemen, my name is Eirik and welcome back to part 3 of Sculpting the King of the Rusted Crown. First of all, thank you for watching, and I'd like to invite you to take a look at my Patreon page. There's a link in the description below. If you'd like to learn how I sculpt or perhaps pick up a cast or two, there might be something there for you, so check it out. This episode is more of the same as we continue with the blocking, but we do finally get to the portrait this time around, which is always quite exciting. As you progress through your sculpture, the vision that you had originally in mind comes alive, and it's a quite exciting feeling. In the beginning of the video, I continue to block in the forms. And what tends to happen is that I progress and I slowly fill in the gaps in between the forms, and while I do that, I lose some of my drawing, or the inaccuracies in the shapes of the forms become more apparent. So I have to redraw them. As I fill in the gaps or the transitions, I also perhaps discover some interesting solutions and find some shapes that needs to be changed and some that needs to be adjusted. I'm slowly getting towards the arms, but as I mentioned in the video of the maquette, I want to sculpt the head and kind of get that up to volume before I get to the arms and hands, as the position of the head will dictate where the arms and hands go. As I work on getting my sculpture slowly closer to the surface, I tend to start along my center line with the modeling. I find that this is the safer area to start, where the least amount of changes will occur. That is, of course, if my center line is well placed, which I do believe it is. At least for now, that might change in the future. I'm still using my hands a lot at this stage to get the clay on there kind of quickly. I don't think there's any reason to spend time with small tools just yet. I do use a big wooden tool that I love, and you can take a look at the tools that I used in last week's video, which was all about the tools. I'll also use a rake every now and then to clean up the shapes a little bit, as I don't want anything to get too fuzzy and difficult to see. So I do my best to separate what is a shape or a form and what is a transition by keeping the shapes a lot cleaner and neater. As I model, I tend to find new shapes as well. So as you work on an area and get it closer and closer to looking like your model, you'll find more and more discrepancies between your sculpture and the model. And the trick is to work towards having the sculpture look like your model slowly, so that any faults in your sculpture can be dealt with as they come up. If I were to do too much to my sculpture too early, I will end up chasing it around in circles for weeks on end perhaps, and maybe not even making my sculpture any better. So I find that working slowly and methodically solves this problem. I try to always be aware of what the decision that I make is based upon, and in this way I can always trace my step backwards if I discover any mistakes, which I discover all the time. So it's good to be able to trace my step backwards and fix these mistakes. Another thing I do as I slowly fill in the gaps and create more accurate shapes is building up the volume. I'm fairly confident in my contours at this point, and as long as I respect them and the borders of the shapes that I've established, I can fill in some volume even at this stage. Of course, while observing from the model. I usually discover that a lot of volume needs to be added towards the end after I've done all my modeling and transitions, and the sculpture is almost finished. But it can't hurt to do some of it right now either. That is, as long as I respect the borders of my contours, of course. I'm also very slowly starting to find the areas where I can lose edges or lose my transitions. When sculpting, I find that a very symmetrical buildup helps create the notion of structure and solidity. Then, when everything is well placed and it's time to start modeling, you lose a couple of edges in an asymmetrical fashion, and all of a sudden the sculpture reads as quite organic. So, in a way, you can achieve two things at once, both of which can be quite difficult. So, I find this is almost like a sculpture hack, the sculpture version of a life hack, really. I'm also doing quite a bit of boring work, like readjusting my contours ever so slightly. While they're pretty much in the right place at this point, at least I think they are, there's always room for improvement. And a lot of this comes from trial and error as well. I make a couple of changes, and some of them work, and some of them don't. So it's important to still remain flexible and not get too married to what you have already sculpted. Okay, so we're on to the beginnings of the portrait. I had some armature issues with my head armature, so I had to redo it a little bit. And I find it a lot easier to deal with this before I put the clay on the armature. If I have to use force to push the armature around after I put the clay on it, the clay tends to work itself loose from the armature, and this is a recipe for cracks. When I spray the sculpture, water will run down into the spaces where the clay got worked loose, and then I'll be chasing these cracks for the entirety of the rest of the time that I spend sculpting the sculpture. And so that's something you want to avoid for sure. And worst case scenario, pieces can even fall off. A lot of this video is going to be me blocking in the portrait. I find it very difficult to place the head on the body, usually at least. There's a lot that can go wrong while blocking it in, and so I take my time and do many measurements and spend a lot of time observing from the model. Portraits can be very tricky, so when sculpting a figure, I think it's a good idea to not do the entire portrait in one or two sittings, and to slowly block it in and allow it to sit there for a while as you work on something else as well. So, you get a fresh eye on it after a little while doing that, I think. I put a lot of work into the neck before getting to the head. Once the head is on there, it can be very hard to make adjustments to the length of the neck without taking many steps backwards. And so to avoid this, I take my time. Because he's supposed to be a king after all, he'll wear a crown, and I take this into account when positioning the head. I made sure to push the head a bit lower and forward to suggest that his head carries the heavy weight of the crown. The idea is that the crown will be made of heavy cast iron, as much of a curse to wear as it is a blessing. I guess to suggest the idea of responsibility weighing heavily on him. And I'll make this even more apparent when I start modeling the neck muscles, as I'll make them more tense and straining than what they actually are on my model. I start blocking in the portrait by working the profile first, and I do my best to get an accurate profile that looks like what my model looks like. Like the width of the pelvis, this becomes the truth that I base every other decision upon. Early on, I place the center line for the head so that I'll have a clear idea of what kind of tilt the head has as well. And I'll always respect this line, as it is what will give me the ability to clearly see asymmetries as they occur, which they eventually will, and it also makes it clear what the solution to dealing with said asymmetry will be. I block in the entire profile, not only the face. I want to have the dimensions of the head established as a whole, so it all works together. Because of the crown, a large part of the head will be invisible, but I block in the entire thing to make sure that I don't make any compromises on making an accurate head. The crown fits the head, not the other way around. Hopefully, at least. The back of the head is also a very interesting feature on my model, and I think it will look quite good and will be visible with the crown on, even with the crown on. And so I take care to block this in accurately as well. So first, I'll look for an accurate profile, and then, once I have that, I will add in the depths and the heights of the bony structures and the features. It's important to take the entire head into consideration. A lot of portraits tend to be a little facey, meaning that there's a lot of face and not enough head. So we want to avoid this. It's important that the entire head is facing in the same direction, and the ears play a big part in doing this, in making this convincing. And so positioning them so that they work with the orientation of your head is extremely vital. A lot of times I'll see portraits where the face and the head are not positioned in the same orientation, and this doesn't look so great, of course, so we want to avoid that as best as we can. Thank you all for watching yet another video in this series, and if you enjoyed the video, hit the like button, and if you'd like to see more, hit the red subscribe button. Please check out my Patreon if you're interested in learning a little bit about sculpture or just would like to get your hands on some art. Thank you for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.